Today, for the National Centre for Military Intelligence, I'm interviewing Commander Steve Foster of the Royal Navy, and we are going to be sharing the secrets of an escape during the Second World War. Commander Foster, thank you for joining me today to talk about this incredible story. Before I ask you how you came across the story, you've shown me a very moving letter that was written to your father, Sergeant Foster, from Mrs. Coulthard. And we've got a transcript of that. I just want to read the first section. And she says, "I suppose you know Anthony Coulthard, or the Professor, from Stalag 20A, perished on the way home on one of those torture marches from Poland. Corporal A.G. Price, who lives in this district, with whom I got in touch, managed to get your address, hence this letter. I would particularly have liked to see you, as I believe you were the co-escapee with my son to the Swiss border in 1942, and from what I have heard, he made the fatal mistake of returning to help you at the last minute. Foolhardy, but praiseworthy, and now he has gone, perished miserably and unnecessarily." So an incredibly moving letter from a mother. You can feel her emotion, her grief. And because he chose to come back, he ultimately lost his life because of that decision. How did you discover the story?
It was about 10 years ago when I decided to trace my family history. I'd recently retired and I thought it was the right thing to do. And my sister reminded me that most of Dad's papers were in an old suitcase that was in the loft. And so up into the loft I went and took down the case, really only trying to discover his military career and anything else to do with his career as a businessman. But within the suitcase, I found a whole raft of letters about an escape that he made with his good friend Anthony Coulthard from Stalag 20A in 1942, as Stalag 20A was in Poland, to the Swiss border. And I was incredulous because he'd never once mentioned the story at all to me, and my memories of Dad are of a very nice and a good father. I knew he'd served in the war, but I had no idea he'd made an escape. So it was quite a revelation.
Well, it must have been a shock. And you didn't know that he'd been a prisoner of war or that he'd had any escape attempt. That's incredible. So he'd had that whole wall of silence.
Yes.
So what did you actually discover in the suitcase which meant that you could piece together this incredible escape, which of course has disastrous turn of events for Coulthard, who was Intelligence Corps, wasn't he?
He was. I discovered a 3-page letter my father had written to MI9 in Northumberland Avenue in reply to their questionnaire from his prisoner's Q form, wanting more information about the escape. And it was a detailed letter explaining that the preparations for the escape took 18 months because Coulthard was a skilled linguist. He was a German linguist. He had spent 2 years before the war in Germany honing his German language, doing his master's degree. And the two of them, it was quite an unlikely friendship, really, because my father was from a working class family. Anthony was from a middle class family from the south. But somehow they clicked and they decided they were going to escape. But they weren't going to do it the normal way of going north to the Baltic. They were going to masquerade as German businessmen, and they were going to speak perfect German to do it.
I remember reading something about that. So they're masking as businessmen working for the company Siemens.
Yes.
And so tell me, how do they actually escape from Stalag Luft 20A was actually Thorn in Poland?
Well, it was 18 months of preparation while Anthony taught my father German for 3 hours every night. Dad had the job of logistics, really. And by getting a job on the camp newspaper as the editor, he managed to get access to a typewriter. And where and how he did it, I don't know, but he forged letters of authority from the company of Siemens to travel to Switzerland. And he also forged 2 Ausweis documents, which are then German passport equivalents, I suppose.
Yeah, the exit permits.
Complete
yes.
with Nazi double eagle stamps, and they were pretty good from what I can gather. And on top of that, they put together civilian clothes, which they got from poles on the outside of the wire by bartering with Red Cross parcel food. And it took 18 months to get 2 civilian suits, 2 hats, 2 shirts, 2 ties, shoes and underwear, because it was imperative they had nothing on them when they went that showed that they were British.
Yeah, and of course your father had actually been captured in Norway, isn't it, if I'm not mistaken, in 1940. So sort of a couple of years later, 18 months into the planning. So tell me how they crossed Germany, didn't they? Which again, you know, is not without its risks. And they head towards the Swiss border. And that's when things become difficult, isn't it, at the Swiss border? And that's what Mrs. Coulthard was referring to with her son. So can you tell me about that?
Yes, so the wire was pre-cut. They had help. They changed into their civilian clothes in an old stable, jumped out of a top window, and then brazenly walked in front of the German barracks, of the guards' barracks, with Germans watching them. German officers, because they must have looked pretty good, as if they were high-ranking German officials, using the Heil Hitler salute, which they had to return. They got to Thorn Station. The first test of their German and of their paperwork, they ordered 2 tickets to Poznan, the next big town to the west. No questions asked, and they got 2 tickets. The 2 o'clock train to Poznan came in, and they got on board. Amazing. They sat in a carriage full of German soldiers. My father's German was only passable, but Anthony's was good. And so Anthony talked to the German soldiers as they asked them questions about who they were and what they were. My father hiding behind a newspaper. And no one suspected at all. At Poznan they got out, but they saw that the ticket office was manned by Gestapo and armed German police, I think. And so they thought the word had got out that they'd escaped. So they went back onto the train. They were going to try and reorder tickets to Berlin. And they sat and thought, well, we'll pay the excess when we get to Berlin. At the then defunct Polish-German border, border police got on board and checked their Ausweis and their letters of authority, and it passed without any comment. And so on to Berlin. And in Berlin they had 2 or 3 hours to wait. But before they got there, there was an incident where Anthony Coulthard had sat on a German soldier's suitcase, an old suitcase, which he didn't know it, but it was full of black market butter and eggs. And as he got up to get out, the German gave a shout of anguish, opened the suitcase, and the butter and the eggs had completely turned into a yellow mess. And they were about to be lynched by this armed body of men, so they ran down the station and got away from them. Recovered themselves. Dad did the usual of trying to read the timetable while Anthony went and bought tickets to the Swiss border. And an old lady, in Dad's words, a grey-haired old lady, came up to him and asked if the 2 were together. And he thought no more about it and said, yes, we are. With that, she went to talk to a very tall, suited man who came over, produced a pass which said Berlin Criminal Polizei, and said, my colleague here has said you've been acting suspiciously, can I see your papers? And they thought the game was up. But they got them out, showed them, and he said, after a couple of minutes looking at them, he said, I'm sorry, gentlemen, but I've got to do these things. Can I direct you to anywhere in particular? And Coulthard feigned indignance and said, no, why should you do this to me? We're going. And they marched off full of indignance. They then had 2 hours to spare, and this is something which I still find quite amazing, to serving British soldiers. They then walked round the whole of Berlin taking notes of every military establishment.
Oh, amazing.
They walked past the SS headquarters, the Gestapo headquarters, the Chancellery, Unter den Linden, and then they got an underground train to Wannsee on the outskirts. And all of the military information they wrote up in shorthand, my father did. And then
collecting intelligence.
Collecting intelligence.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, they were serving British soldiers. So I guess it was their duty. And Anthony was a member of the intelligence corps anyway. They wrote it up and Dad hid it in the lining of his brand new suit, which he had to cut and hide. So back on the train to get the train to Lindau on the Swiss border, and it stopped at Magdeburg, which is where Anthony had spent his time at university. And he went to the name boards and saw that his tutors and professors were still there. And it did cross their mind to hand themselves in to be hidden by them for 2.5 years.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't know how long, did they?
Yeah.
But they decided it was too risky in the middle of a German city because it would put the onus on his masters. So by now Anthony was getting very cheeky, so instead he gave Dad a tour of his university.
It's incredible, yeah.
And then on the next port of call was at Munich, where they went to the Burger Brau beer cellar, where Hitler had made all of his speeches in the 1920, ordered 2 beers, and they sat down and had a beer. And it was the very epicenter of German National Socialism.
Yeah, absolutely.
Back on the train, and now going through Bavaria, they could see the mountains of Switzerland ahead, and they knew that they were getting somewhere new. And they could have shaken hands and clapped each other, but they had to restrain. And finally, the train pulled into Lindau, which is the German-Swiss border. Their plan had been that they would stay on the train while it was thoroughly inspected by the Germans before it went on into neutral territory to one of the Swiss towns. But I think the pull of freedom was too great because the Swiss border was only 100 yards from the station. And they broke away from the plan and they decided to walk across the border. And so they joined the queue. Anthony went first and he showed his Ausweis and his letter of authority to the German border guards, and I think there was a Gestapo agent with him, and he was waved through.
So he got through fine.
So he stood in neutral Switzerland waiting for Dad. We're not sure why, but Dad was stopped and his pass was looked at intensely. He was started to be interrogated about why he was there, who he was, what authority he had. And they had an understanding that if one made it and the other one didn't, that in no circumstance should he come back, that he should continue to freedom. But Dad looked up to see Anthony quite brazenly walking back into Germany.
Oh, no. So he crosses back into enemy territory.
He did. And he walked up, with his usual flair. He walked up to the German border guard and said, "What's the matter? We're Siemens executives. He is my colleague. We're going into Switzerland to look at," they knew the name of the factory, and what seems to be the problem. The guard said, "Could I just see your pass again, please?" And so he quite openly took out his pass and his letter of authority. And the border guard looked at it for quite some time, looking at Dad's and his, and then took his Luger out and said, "Gentlemen, put your hands up." And he marched them to the border guard station where their passes were put under a microscope and they were deemed to be false.
Yeah.
And that was the end of that escape.
And of course, ultimately they are separated. And the tragedy is that Coulthard actually dies, doesn't he, in the long march at the end of the war. Do you know anything about that in particular for him, how he met his end?
Yes, they did 2 weeks in the cooler and they were separated. By then, the Germans were obeying the Geneva Convention of sergeants and above not working. So all sergeants and warrant officers from Thorn were moved to Bavaria, to Stalag 383. Coulthard stayed in the work camp because Thorn was a work camp. The work got harder, the rations got smaller. And a lot of the prisoners were dying now, being worked to death. And for Coulthard, it was another 2.5 years of the same. But during that time, he escaped another 8 times. And there's an MI9 document showing that. So he hadn't given up. But by January 1945, the Germans were losing. The Soviet front was approaching Poland and had broken into Poland. And Hitler decided that the 250,000 Allied prisoners of war were going to be marched to the centre of Germany. I think the aiming point was actually Bavaria. And in January of 1945, they got their marching orders, and they were still in the ragged battle dress that they had been captured in. It was a terrible winter. It was minus temperatures, and snow was on the ground. And in small bodies, they were moved to the west in freezing conditions, and they were treated very badly indeed. They only were allowed to stop in barns overnight. They had no warm clothing. Food was from raw food, scrounged from fields. Water was from ditches. And the majority got dysentery very quickly indeed. And a lot started to die. In Anthony's column, the senior NCO was a Staff Sergeant Aitken, who was a very brave man. And he squared up to the senior German officer in the column and said, I'm going to get you. You've been murdering my men. And I've got the names of who they are and where they died.
Yeah.
And in the end, during that, a lot of they were with Russian prisoners, and a lot of those were shot and bayoneted, but the British weren't. But a lot of them died of starvation and dysentery on the way.
Well, it was horrendous, wasn't it?
And 30 British soldiers in that column died. By the time they got to the River Elbe in March and April of 1945, they were in a very bad condition. The column stopped in a barn just on the west bank of the River Elbe at a very small village. And the guards made all of these very poorly men jump in the River Elbe. I can't figure out why. The river was still very cold, but it might be for hygiene reasons. They all had dysentery and they'd been marching in the same clothes. But it was a death knell for Anthony Coulthard. He collapsed. His friends took him back to the barn where he lay, and they tried to warm him. But at 2 o'clock that morning, he died. The 30th to die in that column. And it was tragic, really, because the column was found only a week later by the British Army. And so he had marched 800 miles, stayed alive, and then had died right at the end.
Yeah, just right at the very, very end there. And it was very moving, wasn't it? Because he was buried, and there's been uncertainty over his exact circumstances in the interim. Can you tell me why you yourself decided to go and find his grave? An incredible thing to kind of do, that connection with him, yes. I suppose through your father.
Well, it was a letter you read out, actually, Helen. When I read that in 2010, and I thought his parents went to their graves not knowing where their son had been buried. I thought it's the least thing I can do, really. And so in 2010, I decided that I would. Well, first of all, I went to Norway to find where Dad fought, and I spent 2010 and 2011 looking at that connection of where he fought. Then in 2012, I decided I would find Anthony's grave. And it was a long job, actually. It took 2 or 3 years. But I thought it was something I could do.
And can I just check at this point, at this point when you're looking, there was no official Commonwealth war grave for him, is that correct?
Yes. What I did discover, of the 30 who died, 23 had been found by the searcher teams which operated in France and Germany after the war for some time, actually, trying to find the missing. They'd found 23, and they were reburied in Berlin Cemetery and given a headstone. The 7 they couldn't find were memorialised on the Dunkirk Memorial because they'd all come from the BEF. Yes. And that's all that Anthony's family knew, that he was memorialised on a memorial in Dunkirk. And so I had to develop a methodology, and I wrote to many people, actually, most of the pastors of the villages around where he died in Germany, to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission to see what they had, to the Army Records Office and to get Anthony's papers, and to the Intelligence Corps. And I got very kind replies, but very few people could actually help me. But it was when I went to Intelligence Corps headquarters, where the museum is, the then archivist let me loose on all of the paperwork they had on Anthony. And they found a letter, the official letter from the MOD to Anthony's parents, letting them know that he had died.
Yeah.
And saying that he had died in a very small village called Kaltenhof on the west bank of the River Elbe. So I had a nugget, I had something to go by. Although Mrs. Coulthard had always thought that her son had died on the east bank in Domitz, and that we'd always thought that the searcher teams couldn't get there because the Iron Curtain had gone down and they couldn't get in. And so we knew we had somewhere. I then wrote to the tourist board in Germany, and they put me on to a doctor of history who lived in the area and said, I'll help you find him. They put something in the local paper which said, does anybody know about the death of this British soldier in a barn in Kaltenhof? And he said, you won't get anybody. And an 83-year-old man came forward and said, yes, I do.
Oh, really?
He was a 13-year-old, younger possibly, 10-year-old boy in 1945, and his farm had been taken over by the German army, and they'd been put in the cellar. And he remembered 200 ragged men coming to stay in the barn. He didn't know what they were. And he was playing in the farmyard one morning when some British soldiers came up to him and said in German, could you get the guards because one of our fellows has died? Oh. And they showed him the body, and he was aghast. And so he came forward and said, I know exactly where he died.
Oh, that's incredible.
And then the Commonwealth War Graves Commission said, well, we've got a record of reburial of 2 British soldiers from Quickbourne to Becklingen Commonwealth War Grave Commission in 1947, and it could be that he's one of them. And so by then I had become close allies with Anthony's niece, Barbara Willoughby Thomas. She came over from Australia, and we met the people involved, and then we walked up to these 2 graves
together,
thinking that her uncle lay in one of them, but they were both unknown graves.
Yes.
And then a minor miracle happened, because one of the graves was actually identified as a soldier, Bombardier Kershaw of the Royal Artillery, and he'd been identified after the war. And so the one remaining grave which said known unto God had to be him. We then had to put the evidence together.
Yes.
And the Commonwealth War Graves Commission insisted that it was written, joined up evidence that led from where he was originally buried to that grave in Becklingen Cemetery. And luckily we had all of the right documentation. We had an affidavit by the man who saw his body.
Yeah, oh, incredible.
We had an affidavit by the staff sergeant who buried Anthony. And then we had the searcher team's relocation form, which said that they'd found 2 unknowns and moved them to Becklingen. And so I wrote a very long letter with all the evidence to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. They gave it a fair wind to the Minister of Defence, the joint, the JCCC as it's called. And they replied and said, we'll deal with it in due course. And I sat there for 3 years, because the MOD was very understaffed at the time, and they're a very busy organisation trying to deal with people like me who think they've identified loved ones. And they have a strict priority order, and if they do find remains, which they're doing all the time on the First World War battlefield, then they have to treat that as a priority.
Yeah, sure.
But exactly in 2015, so it was exactly 70 years to the day that Anthony died, I got a letter dated that date from the JCCC saying, we have looked at your case and we agree with you.
Oh, amazing result. So what happened as a result of those findings, and they concurred with what you'd put together for them? So what happened? There was then a very special ceremony, wasn't there?
Yes. They asked the Intelligence Corps to stage the event as a military service. And so it was a combined event really between the MOD and the Intelligence Corps. Mm-hmm. It was a military service where they provided the platoon with the Corps Colonel and the Corps RSM, And the old headstone, the unknown soldier headstone, was removed, and a very moving headstone with his intelligence corps insignia and some words from his family and his name and rank were put in place. And then the corps padre conducted a service where it was blessed. And it was very, very well done. I was invited to lay a wreath and say a few words. And the most moving part, they got a serving intelligence corps, Lance Corporal, to touch the grave along with the corps colonel and the relatives as it was blessed. So his colleagues from the present day corps were there to honour him, and it was very moving indeed.
You have a sort of continuous link there.
Yes.
With his with the intelligence corps. So it must have been quite a moment for you during that service. Did you find it exceptionally moving?
I did, actually, because my father had died in 1990, so he died some 15 years beforehand, 25 years beforehand, and so it would have been lovely if he could have been there. He would have been 100, actually, but he couldn't be there. So I wore my naval uniform, so I could salute Anthony, and I could salute him on behalf of my father.
So did you think at all during this research how this might affect your view of your father, and how has it affected how you perceive your father now?
It's affected it greatly, actually. I was brought up in a very loving family by a father who never talked about the war. I asked him towards the end of his time. I was in the Navy, I was interested in what he did about his military life, and he only talked about Norway and how difficult that was, fighting panzers with rifles in the snow, but he didn't really talk about being a prisoner of war. And so when I discovered the story, this quiet man who had gone through all of this, on his mind must have been for the rest of his life the fact that that letter had, he must have thought about the words in that letter many times. And yet he seldom talked about it, and yet it must have been there in his mind all the time that his good friend had died. And so I hadn't realised that he what a good soldier he was. And I think common to that generation, they very seldom talked about the war anyway. But it must have, why I didn't put two and two together, I don't know. When I was a boy, we used to go camping to Germany and Austria. And that was where we took our holidays. And it was just something I accepted, that Dad could talk German to the Germans quite easily. And yet he'd left school at 14, and that would certainly not have been taught it at school. And it was only after I discovered the story that Anthony had taught him German for 18 months that I realised why he could speak German.
The whole thing had made sense, and this incredible war, very personally dangerous war. And of course, as a result of all of this, of your research, you've written a book.
Yes, it's called The Soldier Who Came Back. And features Anthony Coulthard and my father on the cover. And I guess it has a double meaning. Anthony coming back at the border, and my father coming back to Britain after the war. I was very lucky, really, that Dan Snow heard about the story, and he came to interview me, as you're doing now, and he put it on a podcast. And Mirrorbook's executive was listening to the podcast on the way home from work one day, and she asked her staff to find me, and they duly did, and she came down to the house, and I told her the story, and she asked me if I'd write a book. She thought it would be a good book, and my English isn't bad, but I'm not a book writer, and so they allocated a ghostwriter called Alan Clark, and between us it took a year, but between us we managed to write a book, and it came out in 2018.
Oh, it's an incredible memorial and legacy to both men, to their bravery and to their honour and their sacrifice. Each of them sacrificed in their own way. And that famous suitcase that you talked about at the beginning. You've brought it, haven't you, to show me today?
I have. Here it is. It's a 1945 vintage. I think it was Dad's demob suitcase, actually. So in here I found original photographs of the two men and of when they were in the prisoner of war camp together. Quite amazingly, an original copy of the New Prisoner's Pie, which is a magazine that he edited and wrote as cover for his forging. Letters, a long letter to Mrs. Coulthard, which had a memory picture that Dad wrote of how he escaped from the camp. And when we actually traced the escape route, it was spot on. His memory was correct. And then a 3-page letter to MI9, the military intelligence for prisoners of war, who asked him more about the escape, and is labelled secret. And it's believed that this letter was used as a citation to award Anthony Coulthard his posthumous mention in dispatches.
It's been an incredible experience, actually, for me too, to hear this very moving story today. Thank you for showing me the suitcase. Commander Foster, thank you for sharing this incredible story today.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
And it was a huge privilege to be able to share the secrets of that escape in the Second World War with Commander Foster for the National Centre for Military Intelligence.
This has been a production for the National Centre for Military Intelligence. To find out more and to support the NCMI, please visit ncmi.co.uk.